Without objection.
I rise in opposition to H.R. 1595. But I want to begin, before I go into the contents of my argument against this legislation, I want to start by commending the bill's sponsor, Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado, for his tireless advocacy, his reasonableness in his approach, and his willingness, even in the midst of the toughest negotiations around the subject matter, to keep his cool, to think through the import of the bill, and to seek compromise where he could. And it is quite a legislative endeavor that he's taken upon for himself, but for this institution, for his state, and for states around the country. He has been a fantastic advocate, and I would say that standing in opposition to his bill, it's not because of his lack of goodwill, it's not for lack of his willingness to engage, but for a fundamental disagreement in the approach. And we've been able to have real discussions around this that I think would make the American people more proud or more confident in this institution and our body politic, more broadly speaking. And I also want to thank my friend and colleague on the committee, Mr. Stivers of Ohio, for his work on the issue. Together, they have conducted themselves with wonderful integrity and respect for their colleagues and their colleagues' views and ideas. And especially on an issue like this where it can create an enormous amount of controversy. 21 states have legalized medicinal marijuana, and 10 states have legalized the recreational use of the drug. However, cannabis remains completely illegal in 19 states. Federal law defines this drug as, quote, a high potential for abuse, no current accepted medical use and treatment in the United States, and a lack of accepted safety for use of the drug under medical supervision, end quote. That is current federal law. This bill does not change the fact that cannabis remains a prohibited Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act. To that end, if we seek to give financial institutions certainty, we should deal with the listing of cannabis as a Schedule I substance, not debating a partial solution for financial institutions to what is a much larger problem and a larger societal issue that we must wrestle with. Should states be allowed to continue to violate federal law? Does federal law need to be changed when it comes to the scheduling of cannabis? We have an FDA that regulates cigarettes and e-cigarettes, which, as we know, the recent announcement, they'll seek a ban on flavored e-cigarettes. But the FDA has no regulatory authority to regulate cannabis. The bill we are considering today is one of the biggest changes to U.S. drug policy in my lifetime, yet is done with little debate. While our committee has jurisdiction over financial institutions, and in the nature of our debate, it's usually about the nature of regulation for the capital markets and for banks, we heard little from the committees of jurisdiction over the Controlled Substances Act or the Criminal Code. In fact, the Financial Services Committee is the only one who's held a hearing on the issue of cannabis this Congress. Now, I would say that is due to the leadership of Mr. Perlmutter and his tireless advocacy for this. But we only had one panel of witnesses. I have voiced my concerns in our jurisdiction to Chairwoman Waters and to Congressman Perlmutter about my concerns for this. In March of this year, I wrote Chairwoman Waters to express my belief that we need to have a better comprehension of the nature of this substance and address the supervisory and regulatory issues that would result from enactment of H.R. 1595. And I ask unanimous consent that I submit a copy of this letter for the record.
Without objection, so order.
In that letter, I listed a number of questions that have yet to be answered, including what steps will federal financial regulators have to take to harmonize standards and protect against illicit activity, including institutions' obligations with respect to the Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering requirements, suspicious activity reports, and currency transaction reports. What are the implications of this bill on non-bank financial firms, including investment companies? I know there's been additions since we've come to the floor to include insurance companies, and I think that's a positive step. But but these are some of the basic questions that still need to be resolved. It's also important that we understand whether this legislation could lead to bad actors like drug cartels that could more easily access our banking system in the United States. These concerns have been echoed by several former directors of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and former administrators of the Drug Enforcement Agency. In a July letter from this year, former law enforcement officials serving from 1981 to 2014 have voiced concerns that the Safe Banking Act could be exploited to provide easier and more cost-effective ways for nefarious groups to launder money. I ask unanimous consent to submit this letter for the record.
Objection, so order.
Mr. Speaker, drug cartels are a significant problem in cannabis legal states like California, Washington, and Colorado. As reported in a May article by NBC News, the cartels have found that it's easier to grow and process marijuana in legal states like Colorado and ship it throughout the United States than it is to bring it from Mexico or Cuba. I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record this article as well.
Without objection, so order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And beyond the regulatory issues, Congress has yet to examine these potential societal harms and implications for human health. In a January article regarding research on the health effects of marijuana, author Malcolm Gladwell wrote, quote, "Before any drug gets permitted to go on the market, basic questions have to be answered about its safety and efficacy. We don't know relatively basic questions about marijuana," end quote. I commend this piece from the New Yorker and ask unanimous consent to submit it for the record.
Without objection, so order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman from Colorado's willingness to work with several of my colleagues on this side of the aisle. I want to commend him and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, once again for their commitment to this effort. This version of the legislation before us right now is dramatically improved and includes a number of Republican priorities, such as language on Operation Choke Point and a solution that will help industrial hemp farmers across the country, but most especially in Kentucky. Yet, Mr. Speaker, there are many questions left to be answered. We do not fully understand the sweeping implications of this legislation. We do not yet know what the resulting regulatory regime will look like, nor do we have any assurance that it will not expose the current financial system to illicit activity. In particular, as it's currently drafted, H.R. 1595 offers insufficient safeguards to prevent drug cartels from accessing the banking system. What this legislation does is provide a half answer to a much larger problem than just banking. We owe it to our constituents and to the public to have a serious debate on the underlying issue. And that is the issue of whether or not cannabis should be considered a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act. I know Mr. Perlmutter and I share that same sentiment that we should have that larger debate. In the meantime, Congress is working in a bipartisan way to come up with at least a measure of solution. But I'm hopeful that we can get the medical research necessary and the FDA processes necessary for us to have that larger debate as well. And I would welcome that debate, as I know the American people would as well. And with that, I'd like to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlemen.